Oh, darling, I have to. I have to sit there. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Do you have to change dates in between? No, I'm just waiting for them.
Okay, can we make a start, please? Just before I introduce Eyal Weizmann, of course, this time of the year we have lots of questions about the papers that have been submitted, and just, I can't have an open discussion meeting now, but I just wanted to say the reason we don't put an example, I haven't put an example online, is that we don't want to impose a model for those research papers that the MFA students are writing. We would rather that you take it in the direction you feel fit. When I marked the dissertations, the final essays last year, some of the most interesting were ones that were highly inventive in their approach to writing a paper. And, but having said that, if you choose to follow an academic model, do include citations, but we are open to different approaches as well. So I'm very pleased that Eyal Weizmann has agreed to give a lecture here. It's very kind of him to do so. And Eyal is an architect and professor of spatial and visual cultures here at Goldsmiths, and where he's director of the Center for Research Architecture. Since 2011, he has directed the European Research Council funded project called Forensic Architecture on the place of architecture in international humanitarian law. Since 2007, he is a founding member of the architectural collective DAAR in Beit Sahour, Palestine. Eyal has been a professor of architecture, also at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and has taught at the Bartlett here in London. Also at the Städelschule in Frankfurt, at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam, and he is a professor invité at the École des hautes études en sciences sociales in Paris. And right at the moment, I'm pleased to say he has a show titled Forensis. He's curated this with Ansel Franke, and it's in Berlin at the House of World Culture, and it's on until May 5th. If you're there, and this is the fantastic book. Have a look after the lecture if you like. Eyal's books include, besides this one, include Mengeles Skull, written with Thomas Keenan, 2012, Forensic Architecture, which was a document of 13 notebook, 2012, The Least of All Possible Evils, 2009, Hollow Land, and the co-edited A Civilian Occupation, published in 2003. He has also realized several architecture and design commissions, including the Ashdod Museum of Arts, and a permanent pavilion for Gwangju in South Korea, amongst other projects. Eyal is a regular contributor and an editorial board member for several journals and magazines that include Grey Room, Humanity, Inflections, Political Concepts, and Cabinet, where he has also been editor-at-large. And he has recently also edited a special issue on forensics for Cabinet. So please welcome Eyal Weizmann.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and obviously delighted to speak kind of here with you in-house. It's kind of it's strange, no, that being teaching here for so many years, one need to be kind of introduced to say, oh, let's say Eyal is coming from upstairs or from that building, etc. So I think I just hope also that between our center and art there will be more joint projects and collaborations, etc. So I'm going to really speak. The title for the talk today was Forensic Architecture. That was also the title of our project, but I'm going to speak really under the title Forensics, which is the way in which we have arranged, collected together the work of this research project, Forensic Architecture, in the exhibition in Berlin. And I'm going to explain, I'm going to speak about what we understand as forensics, why we use this term, and what kind of practice is derived from this term. I think that it is what is important to note in relation to this project, that it's a project that, although it's an exhibition project and a book project, it was undertaken very much at Goldsmiths. This is not the exhibition that we've curated is not. We've not gone about and looked at people's work that are related or interesting to ours, but we've actually produced the work together throughout a 4-year process with our PhD students, who are really one of the most amazing groups of artists, curators, architects, etc., a multidisciplinary group. And it's very much the kind of the work of this group that I'll be showing you today. That's the title, and that is the cover of the book. So what is forensis? Very simply, forensis is a Latin word which meant really, when it was used by such rhetoricians as Cicero or Quintilian, that which pertains to the forum. But the way, and obviously forensis has later evolved into the term forensic, the adjective forensic. And in the kind of long process of this linguistic drift of this word from forensis to forensic, there's been a certain telescoping, and a lot of things were lost in the meaning of the term. So, of course, when in Rome you mention the forum, you mean a kind of a multi-dimensional space of negotiation and truth-finding, in which humans and objects participated together in politics, law, and of course in the economy, some kind of complex marketplace. But in modernity, the words slowly start to kind of to zoom in its meaning to that which pertains to the law. So forensics, as we understand it today, is those things pertaining to a particular forum, and that is the court. And so a lot of things have been lost in this process of modernization. That is, in particular, the political dimension of the term forensics. So now we understand it as simply as science in the service of the law. So by moving from forensic architecture, from forensics to forensics, our first aim is to open up the field and to say we are referring to fora that are beyond the juridical. And it could be a kind of a, as you would see, kind of an undefined space that exists between law and politics, economy, and kind of the public domain. So but forensics, which used to be that great art of the forum, has been completely captured now by the state. It's a kind of a, in fact, forensics is the way in which the state govern and police their subject. It is an act of the police. Forensics is the way in which science is employed by state agents to create a kind of juridical order, or if you talk about migration, a certain biopolitical order. And this is why popular entertainment is so interested in forensics right now. A kind of a CSI of contemporary culture. A crime is always described as a kind of irrational aberration of the order, of the state of social order. Science is employed by state agents to kind of bring back the sort of the order, the social, economical, political order. And but forensics as the act of the police always invites various ways of evasion, a kind of counter-forensics or de-forensics. This is why one of the pieces in the exhibition is taking that image, otherwise taken from a documentary film on migration. So Aisha Hamid was taking that as a starting point in her exhibition to look at the way of escaping identification. If the fingerprint is the kind of the most direct entry point into most identified with forensic practices, its erasure by migrants who do not wish to be identified, classified, understood from where they come from, is an act of evasion in this practice. And this is the reason that we think it is essential to return to forensics. And this is in order to rediscover the political potential of forensics. The challenge of forensics as a concept, and in the exhibitions that we've done in Berlin as a curatorial practice, is to invert the direction of the forensic gaze. It is not about state policing the subject, citizens, or denizens, but rather confronting the abuse of power of states and increasingly of corporations. So rather than the state looking at the citizen, how we can invert it, in which we look at the criminal as the state itself, the corporation itself, and citizens can employ whatever means of identification, perhaps science, in that task. State crime takes place, as you know, overall, but mainly in unregulated frontiers. The frontier is not necessarily a lawless zone, but rather one in which the law is unclear, where the law is out of focus, where jurisdictions are, or claims are, overlapping. And what we mean by that is that what is these kind of lawless spaces of today? These are occupied zones under martial law, frontier areas like Gaza, the West Bank, the border zones of Pakistan, or the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the drone warfare is taking place. Somalia, Yemen, the waters of the Mediterranean, where about 17,000 migrants have drowned in recent years. But also the media and data frontier of the internet. Unregulated, they are all vulnerable to the invasion and abuse by states and corporations. so powerful states and corporations are attracted to these frontier zones. Forensics is that forensics where there is no law, where there is no court. So, and this is something that is very, I think, important to understand about the practice of forensics rather than forensics. Forensics assume that there is a court, an existing protocol of evidence, and existing laws by which that protocol of evidence can be performed in a particular case. And you bring a claim to that existing forum. In forensics, when you are working between states in unregulated zone, there are no courts necessarily. They are not necessarily, sometimes they are. And in fact, the forums have to be assembled in order for the claim to be brought in front of it and to be heard. This is something that is maybe difficult to understand, but if I give you an example, you would perhaps realize that in international law, for example, the evidence always precedes the forum. This is obvious that the Nuremberg trials could only assemble around the evidence, the millions of documents left by the Nazis after the end of the Second World War, or the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, assembles around the remains of Srebrenica or other places. There's a kind of an inversion. The evidence precedes the forum, and that is what happens where there is no necessarily law. The crime is produced before the law. You know that one of the greatest lines of defense of Eichmann in Jerusalem was that when he performed the acts in question in the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, there was no law that he violated. And there is a kind of a Roman principle, anyway, a legal principle by which you cannot be convicted if you have not broken the law at the moment where the act has been undertaken. Nullum crimen sine lege. This is the principle. However, where you are working, we are dealing with a situation where the law is in the making. Because it is unclear, because it is happening in frontier zone, because it is not existing within the domain of the state, the very act of forensics produces or is part of a kind of an act of producing a forum in which the claim could be heard. In order to undertake this project, we've embarked on an experiment, this I mean at the Center for Research Architecture, with two main components that were sometimes complementary and sometimes in contradiction. On the one hand, we've undertaken a historical, theoretical, critical, artistic research, sometimes on the history of forensics, forensic practices, and kind of moments of its development, etc. On the other hand, we have assembled what more simply could be termed the forensic agency, or forensics agency. So we called ourselves Forensic Architecture because we were the Center for Research Architecture. And as I mentioned, our artists, architects, theorists, filmmakers, creators, the people that go to our center, in fact, were the people conducting the investigations. And we were lucky because we received a giant grant to undertake it. So we had the means to undertake it. And we were effectively offering our services to prosecution teams worldwide, but not only legal groups, but also we were working for political groups in other places. So we were like, detectives for hire, just down the corridor in the main building. In the beginning, we did not have many projects. We've assembled a few. And most recently, just 10 days ago, we have submitted our biggest research. So at the end, we could just not take any more commissions. We were in charge, in fact, of producing evidence for the biggest murder investigation undertaken right now. That was the UN investigation of death of civilians in drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Palestine, and in other places. So, but simultaneously we kept those two things together. And when I say in contradiction, it meant that sometimes we, you know, a good defense lawyer, when they read critical text, can very easily mobilize it against truth claims. So when we are in our forensic agency, we want to say that's a fact, this is true, this is what happens. You want to be a strategic positivist about that. Of course, when you are working in a kind of in a critical environment, you want to complicate the notion of truth, of fact, of all those things. So still, with all what we have lost by that, it was necessary for us because we understood that even both parts of the investigation were dependent on the other. So each was dependent on the other. A lot of the access that we've received from actually being involved in juridical process, in producing prosecution files with our movies, and all that. You will see later on, I will show some of those. Was necessary in order to undertake. So we believe that's the only way to undertake research in the world right now. But let's start with what we consider one of the moments of what we call the forensic turn in conflict analysis. So I know many of you have seen this image. We show it very often because it's a kind of a foundational moment for forensics in the service of human rights, international law, or war analysis. It is the first presentations of images, and with that, of images of human remains in the context of the Argentinian junta trial taking place in Buenos Aires in 1985. So with this back to us is one of the greatest gravediggers of the 20th century. It's a man called Clyde Snow, who has investigated the remains of King Tutankhamun, of JFK, of Joseph Mengele, of other people. So he has a wide range of kind of subjects to his analysis. And the emergence of that image, the image of the skull, was important because what was at stake in that trial was the question of the missing people. So presence to find proof, because, you know, I mean, the junta leaders were saying, we do not know where these people are. Perhaps they're having cappuccino in Madrid. That was the kind of the talk at the time. The law had to change a week before the presentation of that image to allow images into court. Previously, they would only exist in files within the kind of the prosecution documents. But here, what you can see is the kind of emergence of human remains as evidence. Of course, they exist in criminal law, but never in war analysis, or with very few exceptions, previous exception in war crime investigations. The reason is that human rights sensibility is very connected to the human witness, to the survivor. That is not only an epistemological focus of human rights movement, i.e. to know what has happened by speaking to her of his memories, mobilize people's memories, but the kind of ethical identification with the individual. Human rights, for better or worse, has this sort of focus on the individual that many people have accused it of being depoliticizing. Human remains were always left mass graves. Were always left as kind of ceremonial sites, religious sites, in the kind of battlefields of war. Never as kind of epistemological entry point. So they, all of a sudden, the witness, and this is what we see, and the object, the skull, are becoming interchangeable here. In human remains, and in particular that skull, the skull of Liliana Priera, one of the disappeared people, become one of those historical hinges to shift that sensibility. For example, Snow, whose one of his most famous quote is, "Bones make great witnesses, they never forget and they never lie," treats human remains as if they were a witness, not an evidence. You know, the difference between a witness and evidence, an object and a subject, is that the witness is interrogated or cross-interrogated, piece of evidence is presented. But here a certain blurring starts to occur. Snow poses question to the bodies and skeletons, to the human remains that he presents. He speaks to them. And indeed, that kind of emergence of the object into the field of human rights war crime investigation is undertaken around human remains because they are the kind of object from which the traces of the subject cannot easily be removed, still haunted by the subject. They're kind of between object and subject, if you like. And what you see here in this picture is also something that we call the forensic triangle. Forensics is a way of, if you like, animating, ventriloquizing, speaking through objects, and that process is undertaken in a kind of entangled relation between three main component parts. They later become much more complicated, but basically three main component parts. An object that is called to speak. A translator, here Clyde Snow, speaks the language of the object and the language of the people in the forum. And the forum itself, here the court. Right? So every articulation is that kind of entangled reality. The object needs the subject and the forum in order for a claim to be made in that particular instance. Today, of course, becomes more complicated because the translator is not necessarily a human, but could be a set of technologies. The object itself is subjectivized, no? It's kind of animated, treated as if it was a living matter. And the forum is not necessarily a building or a court, but a much more complex and networked reality. So the triangular relation becomes more complex, but also to refute a forensic claim, and that is where you would see that in all kind of forensic theory, to refute a forensic claim, what you must do is cut one of the links in the triangle, either between the object and the translator, between the translator and the forum. You either say the object is inauthentic, or the translator does not speak the language of the object, or the translator does not speak the language of the forum, right? So you need to cut, sabotage one of those links. But at the same time, it was another discovery. So a little before the presentation of the skull of Liliana Priera, that was kind of understood in the story of forensics in the service of war investigation. There was another skeleton that emerged, and that skeleton, in fact, in the opinion of Thomas Keenan and I, in the book on Mengelé's skull, was both suspected to be that of Joseph Mengele, the doctor from Auschwitz, one of the war criminals there. So this picture is a few months before the previous picture. It has Clyde Snow in it. And they assemble the pathologists from 5 different countries. Let's say the top scientists of the day are called to Brazil, to a small suburb of Sao Paulo, called Embu des Artes, to examine the remains that were found there, and to verify or confirm or refute the claim that they were the remains of fugitive war criminal Mengele. So what we have here is another trial, but here it's not a trial of human being in which bones are evidence, it's the trial of the bones themselves. And the protocol of this trial are not legal, but peer review. You know, both science and law need to render a certain kind of judgment on what has happened or other things. And whereas legal protocols are to do with jury or not, and judge decision or jury decision, etc. A kind of a scientific claim is having to go through a peer review process, right? The scientists are checking each other's claim as they work through the bones to see whether they do belong to Mengele. And what has happened there is that, in fact, paradoxically, it was the process of trying to identify these bones that happened. You know, as it happened, you put like 20 of the smartest people of any kind of field in a room together, and they come up with a new science. And the science they come up with, they refer to as osteobiography, the biography of the bone. Again, kind of a slippage between object and subject, the biography of a thing. And the idea is in what way the bones themselves register the kind of the movement of a character, a fugitive moving from Central Europe in the 50s to Central America, that register, the geography is registered in the relative humidity as it is penetrated the bones, labor condition, of course, disease, nutrition, etc. All those things create a life story. So the bone itself, as we write in the book, is like a photograph exposed in a very low exposure. Only that the kind of the sort of the silver salt particle, the celluloid of that photograph itself is also mutating. But it's sort of time becoming texture and form, the form of the bone. But what was very important in this process were the skull itself. And it was interesting because Mengele, this is Mengele's young man, was very famous, or became famous for his 1935 PhD dissertation. PhD dissertation can actually make people famous. He wrote it on phrenological science and on the relationship basically between race, skull, and criminal tendencies, etc. So, I don't know, it's almost like a kind of a Dantean punishment that sees the sinner in Inferno castigated by being afflicted with the endless repetition of their own crime. Mengele's skull itself becomes the most kind of studied object, the most handled, touched, and investigated in the 80s. That's Dr. Helmer, a German pathologist and photographer, a brilliant guy, that reconstructed the skull in order to undertake an experiment that was necessary at this case. Imagine during the Mengele investigation, they go bone by bone and they kind of like study it, and the probability that this is Mengele increases to the like upper 80%. But of course, survivors and other general public is not willing to accept that high probability on such a high stake question. What was necessary was an image that would operate in excess of the probabilistic calculus of science. And that image was developed by the image technique was developed by Dr. Helmer as he was projecting images of the person in life onto the skull itself. So face over skull, image over object, subject, object, dead life, all kind of superimposed in this very kind of bizarre consequences. This is like snow again during this investigation. And in fact, it was that image itself that Thomas Kuhn and I call the forensic aesthetic moment, a moment that operates in excess of calculation, in excess of the probability, that creates conviction, which is both obviously the rendering of a guilty verdict, but it's also a kind of an aesthetically constructed sense of belief conviction. It was also true that that technique of investigation developed around Mengele's bones was later used to identify the victims of war. So in the mass graves, for the next 7 years until DNA became workable as a technique, people were identified, skeletons were identified in Chile, in Argentina, in other places based on a technique developed around Mengele. So there's a kind of a historical crude paradox in it. But it's also interesting that we see forensic investigation of dead bodies now hugely popularized. So in Chile, Salvador Allende, the poet Pablo Neruda were recently exhumed. Simón Bolívar's televised exhumation in 2010 was orchestrated by Hugo Chavez. In Brazil, it was the body of João Goulart. In Spain, the remains of poet Federico Garcia Lorca and others. Closer to my home, Palestinian President Yasser Arafat was the most recent in a series to be exhumed. That is actually the report of the forensic investigation looking for polonium traces. The claim was that Israel has poisoned Arafat with a polonium cocktail. They did find 36 times the number of polonium they would expect to find in there. And kind of bizarrely, the forensic investigators, one of the 3 teams of forensic investigators exhuming Arafat, has said this is something, I don't remember exactly the term, but they were saying there is a high probability that he was poisoned by polonium. Of course, Israel could recount that is inconclusive at best. You see, every claim, people believe forensics to kind of to dispel the uncertainty, ambiguity, and contradictions of human testimony. So science will decide, but all science also operate as a matter of probability. It does not escape the main problem on which belief has to operate in excess of calculation. And every claim, even in the natural sciences, is being put with a margin of error. It's like the kind of the beyond reasonable doubt, which is also a calculus of probability for which people could also be hanged or executed, etc. There's always probability. Decision needs to operate, both in law and in science, in excess of probability. Now, so why, who is being exhumed and why? I mean, it is strange to see that all those that I mentioned being exhumed are kind of anti-imperial, anti-colonial perhaps, leaders of the left. So does it mean that we're exhuming Arafat and Allende and Bolivar because the politics that they represent does not exist amongst the living? So these were human remains, but we were interested in architecture and translating what we've learned from that kind of analysis of human remains to an analysis of architecture. So this is part of the things that are on display in Berlin. This is a Hamas, an archive assembled by the Hamas government in Gaza after the 2008-2009 Israeli bombing, where about 20% of buildings in Gaza were destroyed. And it's part of what they call the Book of Destruction, where they've cataloged each building in a frontal photograph and given each building a catalog number, as you see. Sometimes it is just tattooed or spray painted on the rubble itself. And sometimes when the rubble could not take it, it's just been put on something in front of it, or even kind of held in a note when the photographer is there asked to take the picture. I mean, there's a lot more that I've written and worked on this archive, but in this moment I just want to show it to you. as an indication of the importance of architectural evidence recently. And that is because when war has invaded a city, and most wars now are urban warfare, people die increasingly in buildings. When people die in buildings, buildings are not just the location of war, but the instrument by which they die. People die of bits of their homes flying at them at high speed. And therefore, those bits become also very important political, mainly political, but also juridical evidence in that context. I need to skip. This is effectively the story of the collapse of the building in Bangladesh. When we move from testimony to material evidence, from dead bodies into buildings, we've also moved from figure to ground. These two images, I think, are kind of interesting in kind of showing how human rights methodologies are kind of shifting from, okay, this is a very typical kind of human rights photograph. Human rights activists go to war zones and take pictures of civilians, mainly women, children, older people, in front of the ruins. But when that forensic analyst comes to narrate that image, he's not interested in the person and the testimony, but in the ground behind them. And I think that's one of the moments where kind of a misunderstanding of forensics, rather than articulating the ground through a kind of an entanglement with testimony in a forum, a kind of a very clear shift of figure and ground that is most clearly exemplified in that most forensic of all tools or technologies, and that is before and after images. Before and after photographs are the very embodiment of forensic time. And the development of before and after photographs, and this is a well-known, perhaps the first before and after photograph. We have the daguerreotypes taken in Paris of a storming of a barricade. Was born because of a practical problem. The practical problem was that people were moving too fast to capture the event when you need to expose the kind of the film, for about 3 minutes, continuous. So what happens when you expose for that amount of time is that people are kind of getting blurred into the background. The figure is lost, and what tells the story is the transformation in architecture. The human event is being replaced by the architectural event. It is the difference between here and there that kind of tells the story. The event itself and the figure is missing. If you think that this is a feature only of contemporary, of old photographic technique, most before and after photographs that we see right now were produced in newspapers, for example, are satellite images. And satellite images have the same limitation. They can return to the same site only in given intervals. Most often they miss the events. And most often than not, or always, the resolution by which a satellite image is designed to capture a place is at a resolution that erases people. So you never see people in satellite images. I will explain to you later more about it, but it becomes very structural to our investigation. So 150 years after the invention of photography, the same condition persists. It's the event of architecture, the transformation from the before to the after that replaces the human event. Again, I need to skip a couple of projects because I see that they're moving very fast. It's an investigation we've undertaken in Guatemala, and this is in other works. So I just have to move on through it. So far we've seen two kind of major transformation, conceptual transformation that forensics imposes. One is a kind of a shift or a blurring between subject and object, and the other between figure and ground. And what I've shown you before when those images I ran through is a series of images that were submitted as part of our investigation, either in the Amazon basin, in Guatemala, or in other places where we have investigated, in fact, the ground itself, transformation of the landscape and built environment. Another very important contemporary shift that forensic technology imposes is a shift from the past to the future. So if we think about forensics as finding traces of destruction, death, dead bodies, or crime in the past, the most important forensic practices now are predictive forensic practices that have to do with destruction that has not yet taken place. It is very weird, perhaps, that the two fields that are dealing with predictive forensics, with destruction that will take place in the future, seemingly have nothing to do with each other. One is to do with climate change, in which the future, whether it is models simulating the growth of the ozone hole or other climate change transformation, other destruction that would happen as a result of climate change. Of course, it's a kind of forensics of the future crime, or the future trace of the crimes undertaken now, in terms of pollution, etc. But the evidence is in the future. And the future is inhabited by algorithmic model. The future is a mathematical construct that predicts to variable probabilities and degrees level of destruction will take place. But then if we think also on contemporary counterinsurgency tactics, mainly those employed by Israel and the United States, we realize that the juridical opinion given for targeted assassination are to do with the crime, quote unquote, that people pose in the future. So, for example, if you're an Israeli operator of a drone, by law, you're not allowed to kill a person for what she or he has done. Maybe that's what he has done. That is the task for juridical proceedings. Targeted assassination, according to this legal opinion, is only there to prevent or preempt a kind of an attack or danger that will have happened in the future. Somebody could have been a mass murderer, but if they're out of action at a particular moment, you would not get the kind of the regulatory permission to kill or kill, but then you have to argue it as a kind of a prevention of a future thing. So here on the right-hand side, we've reconstructed this chain that is there also to predict what people will have done in the future, what risk they pose. And assassination is an intervention in a chain of events that have not yet taken place. So I was talking about drone warfare and our investigation of drone warfare. And this is something that we undertook at the Center for Research Architecture with a big group, including Susan Schupli and Stefan Kramer and Jacob and Situ Studio and other people. And that inversion from past to future, from criminal to preemptive forensics, is happening exactly in those frontier zones. Zones that are outside of sovereignty and outside of law, like, again, Gaza, Somalia, Waziristan, parts of Yemen, etc. So this is the inversion from past to future happen in those frontier zones. Drone warfare also operates in a very basic level by an intervention, as an intervention in the field of vision, by amplifying, heightening the vision, the visible capacity of those undertaking those killings, those operators through integrated optics of satellites and drones and other platforms in the air. But crucially, through the reduction of visibility of all others. If we think that drone warfare is simply this high-tech, hyper-visual, kind of warfare that operates within high-tech visibility, it also has a very old-fashioned territorial kind of manifestation. It can only operate in places that are physically isolated. So Gaza, the walls around it, the siege is what enabled drone warfare, both what justifies it juridically, but what enables it to take place. Waziristan, where most casualties from drone warfare have been recorded by us and by others, is also a zone which is outside of the effective control of the Pakistani state. Not only is it outside of the effective control, kind of semi-autonomous zone there, it is under siege by Pakistani military that does not allow anyone that does not live there to enter or exit. And if those very rare people that get permission to enter and exit Waziristan are not allowed to take a mobile phone, a camera, a computer, or any electronic equipment with them. So it is creating a kind of a black hole of visibility and amplifying US visibility over it, inverting past to future within that. When we have investigated this form of warfare, we have continuously received images from Gaza, from other places that look like that. That's a signature of a drone-fired missile. Most missiles are hitting buildings. Buildings are the most common target. Most people that die inside buildings, as I mentioned before. But the missiles that are being fired on buildings have a very specific technical signature. Unlike old-fashioned bombs that would detonate at impact. So the bomb has a kind of a detonator at its head. When it feels the impact of the ground, it activates the explosive device and the entire building would be destroyed. Drone warfare aims, it's part of the kind of the lesser evil tactics, something I've written about a lot in my book on the list of all possible evils, to minimize civilian casualties. So by attempting to minimize civilian casualties, it is allowed to proliferate, right? So there's a lot of little small evils that are kind of being perpetrated. So it's structural to it to reduce the level of casualties, what's called collateral casualties in it. And to do that, what they do is to put a delayed fuse on the head of the missile. So it does not blow off in impact, but a fraction of a second after that. And that means that the missile or the bomb goes through the ceiling, goes into the center of the room, and then it blasts in hundreds of small steel fragments that are supposed to kill people in close proximity to them, with making minimal damage to the environment around it. So it's very important to understand that principle, to understand the following problem that we have. So a hole in the roof is a signature of drone-fired missile in an assassination attempt. This is in Yemen, in Pakistan, and in Gaza. You always see those holes in the roofs. Sometimes those holes are very small. This is in Gaza. Go closer to it, you see it's about 4 centimeters. But it goes inside through the ceiling, sometimes through 2 layers of ceiling, and killing people. Depending, you can shift the kind of the delay on the fuse if you wanted to go to the 3rd floor under. You put the time that it takes the bomb to go through 3 layers and then detonate under. Now the problem is, which is our problem, but what enables drone warfare, is that satellite image is reduced by law to a resolution of 50 centimeter a pixel. And the resolution of 50 centimeter a pixel is 50 centimeters 50 centimeters square is a single colored surface. And the reason that it was reduced so, and it was reduced in the 1998 Remote Sensing Act, it's an American law, American dominate the satellite market, is to stamp out humans from those photographs. This is why you have a before and after image in which you don't see people. And the reason initially was that satellite companies wanting to sell their image would take an image in a city, would have thousands of people in there, which make them vulnerable to privacy claims. So they stamp it out by a pixel. There is no way, you do not need to camouflage from a satellite image, because the satellite image is designed to erase you. I'm referring to a piece of work that is on show now. It's not necessary to camouflage from a satellite image. So the hole that the drone fire rocket makes is 30 centimeters in diameter, and the size of the pixel is 50 centimeters in diameter. The violation is what could be termed as under the threshold of detectability of the satellite image. Right? You will not see the hole in the roof. You do not know in which pixel it is. We knew that one of those pixels is a hole in the roof because we know that building was attacked, but we couldn't have seen it. Now, the politics of resolution is very complex because it includes also other considerations like geopolitical pressure. For example, Israel has put pressure on the American Congress to make the resolution in Israel and its occupied territories for 2.5 meter pixel. A building in Israel would appear in a satellite image as 4 pixels. A car, not a human, is a single pixel. So cars are stepped out in that resolution. And of course it was the flotilla events in 2010 between in a conflict between Turkey and Israel that was one of the main reasons why Turkey is sending a satellite into space in order to provide images of Israel in the occupied territory at half a meter resolution. So there's a whole geopolitical frontier that exists within the pixelation of satellite images. But what it means is that techniques like the UN was employing previously, and I guess this is why they commissioned us. Of course, UN does forensics by sending the satellites, taking before and after images. We know that building was attacked before and after. 5 people died in that building and you can't see anything. There is no event of architecture happening on this scale. This enabled a formulation that the US is now employing that is officially sanctioned as the Glomar response. It's a form of denial that aims to add no information whatsoever to the public domain. Under its term, US state agencies are authorized to neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of documents requested under the Freedom of Information Act, and as to neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of a secret war of assassination in Pakistan. You see, denial here is not a rhetorical act. It's a juridical, technological, to do with a siege condition. It's to do with an entire intervention in the domain and flow of space and the circulation of images. That's called the Glomar denial. It's a kind of an interesting story because the Glomar, if you think that that was always existing to neither confirm nor deny, until '76, when the Glomar response was kind of sanctioned, the US would simply say, no, they're not allowed to deny something which is untrue. They can neither confirm nor deny. When you deny something, you add information to the system, or you tell a lie. It's not like, climate change denial or Holocaust denial or anything like that where you need to come with an alternative story. You seek to provide a kind of a zero information by making that, but of course there is nothing like zero. There's always traces of information even in the Glomar denial. The Glomar denial was about this boat Glomar that the CIA was not feeling like telling its story. It's maybe a bit complicated now to describe. So in order to undertake this investigation, we had to combine, as I will show you, the three frames that I initially went through. Forensic architecture, an analysis of buildings, the witness, the survivor, and the dead body, into a kind of, again, a sort of entangled articulation. We had to invert. Forensics is to take the forensic gaze against the state, to invert the forensic gaze. Forensics 101 since Bertillon is that the state needs to see in higher resolution than the police, than the criminal. If the criminal kills with the naked eye, the police needs a telescope or microscope, other kind of enhanced optic techniques. When the state sees, when the investigator sees in lower resolution than the criminal, you open the space of denial, the space that allows neither confirm nor deny. In fact, the Glomar response is undertaken at the level of the image itself. So in order to invert it, that was our brief from the UN. And we were trying to come up with various techniques of working within that limitation. We were lucky to have been exposed, because it was broadcast, with a bit of footage that was smuggled out of Waziristan. So it's an iPhone footage, I'll show it to you in a second. It had to pass through 6 hands, from one hand to the other, to the other, to the other, until it managed to escape the siege lines of Pakistan and arrive, of Waziristan and arrive at the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad, and from there it was uploaded and broadcast by NBC. 22 seconds, 24 frames a second. Each frame we've studied. It's a study that took about eight months to undertake, which was claimed that it was taken a day after the March 31st, 2012 strike, in which 4 people were killed in a market area in town. It's a very rare footage, and this is why it's a kind of footage that was taken with a risk of life to be delivered. A kind of, if you know this discussion of Foucault on parrhesia, this is a very kind of clear demonstration of testimony delivered with a risk of death. So I'll show you the okay, this is the 22 seconds as broadcasted by NBC. And you see more or less an indistinct pile of rubble. It's more a manifestation that something has happened. We don't know where it is in Waziristan. We do not know what we're seeing beyond a pile of rubble. And that was exactly our aim in kind of isolating frame by frame and looking at it also through the frame of what we have learned from our curators, friends, art historians, etc., and employing them as evidence here. So the first thing that we see that becomes very important in this image is actually what you don't see. And that is, or what hides what is supposedly the subject. That is the frame. There's a concrete bit of the window frame, and here a concrete bit of the window frame again. That means to us that the videographer is not standing at the window, but that the videographer is standing a few steps back from the window. And that raises question. Why is the videographer not, if you want to film something from the window, you just lean over the window and take the footage that you want. You see the building has no window frame, it's just an open frame. So that means to us that the videographer is scared, that he's under threat. And why? I mean, we do not know, but it's a very important thing to, because when you analyze a video, you analyze two things. You analyze what you see, and you have information about the person taking that image. That kind of supposedly non-information is very important in telling us that either that person is scared from a double tap, which is American waiting for people to gather inside of drone strikes and shooting again, or perhaps from the Taliban that are controlling that place. But we don't know where this place is, and that becomes the first task for us to identify. So we're looking at one frame and we are seeing the direction of the shadow, and the shadow is cast forward, north by northwest. So we know we are sitting in a building that is higher than the building in question, and we're looking northwards. And what we do is we take each frame in this video and we create this collage that gives us a better picture of the ruin. But still, we don't know where this ruin is. We're looking for some features in the photograph, like the bend in the road, or this kind of widening in the road. And we're going through this town through a satellite image and scanning it for all pictures that has a higher building in the south, a bend in the road, a certain widening in the road, and we suspect that it might be this building. So we look at we try to compare the satellite image and the image there. We see a series of radiating beam on the left side of the ruin, and we see a series of radiating beam on that building. You see a high tower in the ruin, and we see a high tower in the satellite image. It's very tedious, but you have to go through it. You see a higher building on the other side, and a higher building on the other side, in the satellite image, the widening of the road. And so we're pretty convinced that we've got the right building. In fact, one of the first buildings to be identified in this whole kind of like secret war. So we buy the satellite image of a day after the strike. So that should show the destruction in it. And we zoom into the satellite image. But because of that pixelation that I mentioned before, we do not know which of the pixels are describing that sort of rubble within that image. So we have to do it another way. We have to work differently. 4 images, and we find also a kind of an aerial view. We sketch the contour of the building, and by analyzing the length of the shadow, we're able to understand the volume better, and we create a model, a 3D model of the building, and we locate it in the site, and we model the destruction as we see it in the image, and we locate it in a kind of in a model of the city. And what becomes very important for us is what time of the day that video, not the attack, but that video was taken. So we take kind of an aftershot of the destruction in a model, and we run it through a computer program that simulates sun movement, and we try to get exactly, you see those 3 frames, that frame is exactly sitting on there, that, and that, so we know that it's 5 o'clock, which will become important later. Now there's also another bit of footage in that 22 seconds. It shows you also again the hole in the roof of an interior space. So we do the same. We kind of compose that image of the interior and we're looking through it, we're taking the direction of the shadow. So now we know we know the time of the day. We assume the interior was taken right after or right before the shot, the outside shot. Now we know it's the time of the day, so we are able to locate the orientation of the room, because we use the hole in the roof through which the lethal rocket has entered as a compass, and we are able to orient the room and locate it within the building. So, and we also, in that there's a second where you see somebody, and you see a hand inside the room, and you see also a fragment. So, very patiently, we got an archive of fragments of drone missiles, and we kind of see that the form of the fragment and somehow its color is not dissimilar to those fragments. But what is more interesting, behind it we see shrapnel in the wall, like chips in the wall. And we take a very close view at the wall. It takes us a lot of time to mark each hit of those, remember I told you it's like those shrapnel as kind of scattering the room. This is where the rocket has entered. And we see two spaces there where there are less fragments in the room. And we assume, although we cannot know for sure, that this is where people stood and absorbed in their bodies the fragments. So here, architecture and the dead body become one. No, I mean the forensic architectural analysis and the contour of the body are combined in this story. And also, it is interesting that the wall of the room are like a photographic film. No? You have a blast in the center, almost like the shadow of people in Hiroshima or something like that. And the materiality of the room becomes a media device on which the bodies are registered. Another thing, I see I'm really, Mark, do you want me to stop here, or do I have another 5 minutes? I mean, I have much more, but I want to speak to you guys also. So I'll just show very briefly another way of attempting to invert that forensic gaze. And that is, we have learned about a woman, a German woman, that managed to escape Waziristan because of her passport. And she was in a house during an attack in Mir Ali, another town in Waziristan. And she was kind of campaigning against drone warfare. And we're delivering a testimony, but somehow her memory was in fragments in itself. And I think you can understand it when you have experienced what is effectively the worst day of your life. It is the most traumatic moment that is being erased from memory. And she wanted to give a kind of a testimony, and we were helping her through architectural means, kind of understanding the proximity of architecture and memory. We have decided to employ a technique by which we would build with her together an architectural model for the entire day. Every bit in her house that she can remember, every object within it she would put, and to see whether you can reconstitute the memory. Of course, we were kind of tuned to all sort of understanding of the relation of architecture, destruction, and memory to the art of memory and other things. But that was a bit of a different experiment. I'll show you a bit of it.
Das Krankenhaus irgendwo hier in der Nähe war,
ja.
Die Moschee auch ganz nah an uns, irgendwo hier im Umkreis. Aber so den Grundriss hatte ich immer im Kopf gehabt. Ich habe ja auch länger da gelebt, Tag und Nacht. Und hier war auch wieder so eine riesen schwere Eisentür, genau wie auf der anderen Seite. Mhm. Richtig, ja. Und ja, ich würde das etwas weitermachen. Okay. Ja, so ist okay. Stopp. Ich erinnere mich gerade, die Tür weiter geht und das Fenster auf der Seite. Mhm. Ist einfach, genau. Kann ich das einfach von oben sehen? Dann kann ich das besser. Ja.
Dann hilft diese Visualisierung, um sich mehr daran zu erinnern, was passiert ist vor jetzt knapp 2,5 Jahren.
Und das hat mir schon sehr viel geholfen, muss ich sagen. Ohne den Grundriss wäre ich nicht darauf gekommen. Ja.
So, ja. Also das sind verschiedene Sachen.
Das würde ich mal.
Das Bett?
Ja, hatten wir im Hof stehen. Dann ist halt. Ja, ich würde es mal weiter an die Tür rücken.
Being very, very precise. I mean, we were shocked by the level of precision she demanded of us. And,
ja, also wir hatten da so einen ganz großen Teppich stehen. Oder zwei verschiedene, ja. Und hier so eine Sofaecke, also halt auf dem Boden diese Matratzen, ne? Und dann hatten wir hier in der Mitte unseren Tisch aus Holz. Ich würde mal auch hier auch so einen ganz großen Teppich machen, den wir da stehen hatten. Da haben wir manchmal gesessen und mit den Kindern gespielt. An dem Tag sind ja zwei Jungs aus Deutschland gestorben. Und der eine davon hat manchmal in seinem Zelt bei uns im Hof geschlafen. Aber es war wirklich sehr klein mit seiner Frau, aber nur manchmal. So Lego-Steine hatten wir auch.
Lego.
Ja. Gekocht haben wir halt mit so einem, ich weiß nicht wie die heißen, diese Gas. Aha. Ah ja, Ventilator fehlt noch, ja. Ja, im Hof, so, diese Position hier.
Ein Standventilator oder hing der irgendwo oben?
That was an incredible thing with the ventilator because she kept on moving it around. She kept on being disturbed by the ventilator. And we did not know why it was. Maybe she was hot or not. In her experience, the ventilator returned again and again and again. She was never kind of content with its location, moving it from left to right, etc. And when we did a reconstruction of the destruction, kind of located her within the fully rendered space, she remembered that it was on the blades of the ventilator that she had found human flesh. And the ventilator held a kind of a memory, a difficult memory, and it was through that kind of reconstruction that she had accessed it. And I think also that ventilator is a media form in the sense that it contains and disseminates this information, and somehow what I want to say is that these bits of evidence, those two films, are part of a very long series of work. You can see them in Berlin. There's about 5 of those videos, each one about a different way of knowing beyond the kind of the image siege that is imposed on Pakistan. And it's exactly because these are not the hard evidence. These are not hard evidence. They would be very vulnerable to a good defense lawyer in cross-examination. Although we were trying to be as precise, and we've taken a lot of legal advice about how to do each one of those things, you never know what is accepted in court and how things are operate in relation to evidence. So these are weak signals at the threshold of visibility, but still, being under the threshold of science and under the threshold of law, make them potentially be in excess of science and law. And I think that is one of the main kind of principles of forensics. If when you operate against the state on lower resolution than it is, your evidence is always going to be at the threshold of visibility. Because the threshold of visibility is the threshold, is a frontier in which crime takes place. Crime would take place under the size of the pixel. So I think this bit of evidence testifies for us both that kind of principle of, you know, it's not architecture or evidence against testimony, it's a certain entanglement. It's a certain way in which here architecture is not an evidence, material evidence, but a way to access memory and somehow deconstruct that division between subject and object, between information and human, etc., etc. It connects architecture memory at the point of destruction and opens for us, I think, the kind of the very question. I think this, in a certain way, it kind of comes back to that moment of the skull and Liliana Pleyera and this sort of forensic triangle. And kind of demonstrate that, you know, to work politically with forensics means that those weak traces at the threshold of visibility need support. They need kind of a political will, a political organization around them, mobilization around them, that would make use of them to make political claims. So I think that it's a certain advantage also to work under the threshold of science and law in relation to that. All right, let's stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Any questions, please?
I have a question about hardware. I guess I'm thinking of there's a kind of control over a production of hardware that's within the control of like certain states, you know, with questionable ethics. I'm also thinking of how like the NSA, for example, has the ability, as revealed by certain WikiLeaks documents, to they have a USBs that basically turn into wireless devices to be beamed straight to them. Information gets sent straight to them from these USBs unbeknownst to the person who owns them. So there's situations like this. And I guess what you've indicated is like also a situation in which technologies determine like law, politics, war. And this is like a process which like you and some other people try to blow the whistle on and trace and mitigate to an extent. I guess I'm wondering like how you see that kind of chase between like production and mitigation like panning out, like when there's such sovereignty over the production of hardware by such few organizations.
I think it's a very good question. I think, I don't know. It's about the hardware, no? That the state has better hardware?
Or, yeah, or that maybe the state has some level of control over the production of kind of the, you know, material by which these things pan out. Whether it's the USB stick or the drone or
the internet.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah. I think, you know, I think it's, you know, finally, there's always, you know, kind of bits of hardware or technology or software that is inaccessible. But I think no technology is under control of anyone. I think it's, finally, it's, you know, it's a battlefield over images and over the use of various technologies. You know, some people say, well, if satellite images are the product of kind of Cold War technology, right? I mean, this is an older stuff, not the one that you just referred to. It's something that we, should never use because this is contaminated by military logic. And I don't think so. I think, first of all, it shows you that satellite images are exactly those which are. This is the public stuff. This is the low resolution stuff. The 3 millimeter pixel is coming from the drone. So there's the struggle that goes within technology rather than over technology, right? Or within the image rather than over the image. And it operates by different means of interpretation. No? What can you see within that image, or how can you produce an image that would operate using the same technologies that the bad guys are using? It doesn't matter for us. I would use everything I can get my hand on and I can afford at a given moment, and I try to mobilize it, to invert its kind of logic. But I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, it wasn't as much of like a master's tools kind of thing as it is about who gets to make these things and who's quicker in the end, I guess. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, we know who makes it. I don't know what I can add to this, but it's how you use it. There's in a sense, I would just say that the kind of the struggle is on every step of image production, image interpretation within the technology itself. I don't have much to add on that.
That's good.
Thank you. You're not disappointed by this lame answer.
I'm not disappointed.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Back there.
I'll go. I was wondering about about your practice and how if it's fair to say, the earlier, more kind of theoretical background to the talk, how that transitions into the final 2 examples that you showed, as kind of where the theoretical background of the project materializes. I'm interested to know at what point, they gather, and you can start using them as a real practice.
It's not really a kind of a formula or process by which we first do the critical, historical, theoretical investigation, and then the practice. And what I showed you are 2 examples out of the drone project that has 5 cases, and on that scale, and many other information on other scales. And the drone project is one of 25 investigations we've undertaken. So we worked with prosecution in Palestine, Guatemala, in the Mediterranean. There are very, very many other places worldwide. It's a very particular kind of thread that I cut through it. It's by no means represent the entire project. Also, the Mengele book or work and the work on the human remains are one of about 15 kind of historical, theoretical pieces that are all in the show. And so there's, in no way it's linear, it's as linear as one makes it when one packages it in a presentation, no? But the principle was always to do everything together and simultaneously, to have a forensic agency to work like, artist detectives or whatever you want to say, call it, and to work for real prosecution cases or UN investigations or political organizations of various sorts, and simultaneously to kind of undermine our own tools, question our own tools through a series of forays into kind of the history and theory of forensics. So they have to be undertaken together. They're not stages in which one validates the other. And right now I'm both writing material about, historical court cases and something else, and I advise human rights organizations in the UN and all sorts of people about real cases. But this is what gives intensity to the work, to take it from those two sides. And it makes you vulnerable on both fields, because in the field of law, if they know about the more critical questioning stuff, how can you be an expert witness when the defense lawyer is telling you, but you wrote that about truth or about facts being made, or I don't know. I mean, how can you even take yourself serious with your own claims? And then the artist guys, when they see that we work for those kind of compromise organizations like the UN or this kind of thing, or for prosecutors are saying, but guys, don't you know that we need to be very critical about this organization? And everybody's right, and so we have no friends left. But we think that this is the way to do research in a world that we're fully aware of the violence in the international law, the problems of human rights. We've written about it, but we try to bring it productively into our practice.
Perhaps I could take up that question from a slightly different angle. Some years ago, I worked on Derrida's Memoirs of the Blind, which I argued was really a book about Holocaust denial in the context of revisionism. And one thing Derrida wants to do there is make a pretty strong distinction, which you brought up as well, between evidence and testimony or witness, so that the evidence doesn't in a way suppress the testimony, that they in a sense go in a different direction. I mean, the witness or testimony, even if it's wrong in a sense, even if it can be factually disproved, demands a certain kind of recognition. And it seemed to me that towards the end, in a very interesting way, you were trying to bring them together, but in a different way. I mean, in a sense, the testimony, in a sense, produces a certain kind of evidence, which even if its status is not the status of a fact that can't be disproved, will affect the forum in a certain sense, and the politics you were talking about, however that might be. And I was also thinking at the same time as you were talking that the sort of period of this sort of discussion of forensics had a kind of parallel in the novel, where photographs proliferated. I'm thinking above all of the novels of W.G. Sebald, using photographs in relation to a text that may or may not be fictional. The status is kind of unclear. So that then raises also the question of the relation between fact, testimony, and fiction as a kind of life writing, what the status of that might be. I'm not entirely sure where this question is leading, but I'm wondering really what you're doing with the relation between testimony and evidence, what the direction of it is, and how it might relate to, I mean, not art coming from a certain position, but shifts within art itself.
I think about shifts in the art, you would be infinitely more qualified to speak. But I think that I want to start really from where your question started, with the problem or the period really where philosophy, and it wasn't only Derrida, had to deal with denial, in particular Holocaust denial. And right now what I'm writing is the kind of the accounts of the 11th and 12th day of the Irving trial. And David Irving, who's kind of one of the best known Holocaust deniers, had a very simple principle of denial. He confronted matter against memory. And he had some success, and he kind of rode on his success. So Irving, in 1985, same year, when Ileana Pereira-Scala is being expressed there, is the guy that would insist against all historians that validated the Hitler diaries as Hitler's voice, those people that were tuned to question of character, psychology, historical facts. He went to the press conference where they were validated, and he said a simple thing. He said, check the ink. Of course, nobody bothered to check the ink before, and the ink came back in 1954. So all that kind of, psychological, historical investigation was kind of washed out by the negative evidence of the ink. And this is what he tried to do in the trial, where a very similar question of the hole in the roof was the main issue. They were debating Crematorium 2 in Auschwitz, which is the only building that was left standing after the German retreated and blew up everything else. And his claim was that for that to have been a death chamber, you needed to have on the ceiling 4 little holes. And those holes were the holes through which the poison was poured into, the cyclone B was poured into the rooms. The problem is that they do not exist today, those holes. There's many speculation of why they're not there. And there was, at some point there emerged an aerial image in which they read a certain layer on the images, either the whole or not all. But what I'm trying to actually comment is that the emergence of forensics or forensic architecture within urban discourse is not a question of positivism but of denial. And the fundamental denial is a denial of memory. So negation rather than positivism. It is evidence that is mobilized against memory, against testimony. Of course, all the survivors are lying and all the Nazis are lying because they all have interests, but the matter would arbitrate here, like the ink arbitrated in that trial. So it's very similar threshold detectability thing on the roof, like the Mir and Shah thing with all the different historical contexts, etc.
It's very close to 7 o'clock. I think if there's one more question, we could.
Oh, okay.
We could end with that. I think.
Yeah. Right.
Give someone a chance.
Hi. Thanks. While I was listening to your lecture, it came into my mind the term ruins in reverse from Robert Smithson, and I was just wondering what's the relation, because I didn't get what was the relation with the future. Is it like these ruins that you were talking about, is it they rewrite the past in order to get a new future, or what do you mean about this forensic architecture that is connected to the future?
You'd see that the greatest fantasy of every forensic scientist, whether they exercise what they call forensics or forensics, is a certain non-privilegedness of the direction of time. Forensics is about running time backwards and forwards, from building to ruin, from ruin to building. It's very much the kind of the building in inverse of Robert Smithson. He speaks about this hotel in Mexico. Huh? Palenque, Hotel Palenque. Yeah, you see, I know something about art. I know it's Mexico. I'm not an artist. I look at art. I learn from artists. I learn a lot. I learn from Farocki. I learn from many people. I'm looking at art, but fundamentally my stakes are somewhere else. But I'm very moved by that idea of future ruins. Kind of an analysis of destruction that has not yet taken place. And I think that's somehow also the frontier of our practice. Maybe that's something about, maybe that's what part or an aspect of what art or architecture should be. An analysis, not a history of the past, but somehow the ruins yet to come.
Or could it not be prevented?
And yeah, preventing usually makes things worse, but let's say.
Well, no, I mean, you mentioned in the case of then the insurgents or the, killing someone before the potential for them to kill anyone else. That's kind of the same circumstance.
Yeah, but then killing and killing and
I'm not saying
killing
that
always
usually
makes
it's
more
a reason
killing.
to prevent killing.
Yeah, that is the juridical logic, you're right. I mean, they think that if we have an evidence, if the algorithm comes with a calculation, and these are algorithms making those alerts. They say, okay, that guy was driving on this road and this date, and now he's conniving with this and this man here, and then he's moving. That's a pattern. It's called pattern recognition. And that's a pattern that the computer identifies a pattern which could convert into a lethal attack. And then the computer says, well, that's in probability, da 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 da, it is an attack. And then they say, all right. So, okay, so maybe they kill this guy, but I think that societies that are subjected to ongoing violence, that violence is not disappearing, it just becomes part of the fabric of it. So it's never reducing the amount of violence that exists within a system.
Yeah, but also
within history, violence only increases. So I don't know. I would argue with the effectiveness of that, but I understand and describe the logic of that.
Well,
Yeah.
and also like Robert Smithson said, like new monuments help you to forget the future instead of remembering the past. So this kind of game with the timeline.
Well, Robert Smithson is a forensic scientist. That's good. I'll get a PhD on the case. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what he said.
I think we'll close it there. I invite you for a drink at New Cross Tavern again.
Thank you very much.
Please come. Thank you very much, Eyal.